Let's start from where I come from. I come from Argentina. Maybe you know some of these characters from my country, apart from tango, from the wine. So we are very well known about these people. But also we are very well known for a past of political violence. During the 20th century, we have 6 military interventions in our life, and the last one was in 1976 and last until 1983. One of the consequences of this intervention was the disappearances of around 30,000 people in those 8 years. People were buried in cemeteries. Most of them were young people who were kidnapped from different circumstances, taken to a clandestine center, mainly in police or military compounds, and executed. In around 500 cases, pregnant women were kidnapped, and after they were birthed in a clandestine center, the babies were taken from the mothers and given to police or military families, and the mothers killed in most of the cases. So the bodies of the people who disappeared were buried in cemeteries around the country, or in other cases were taken to airplanes alive and dropped to the sea or to the river between Argentina and Uruguay in a number of cases that we don't know. In 1984, thanks to the pressure of the society and the human rights organizations, we have a new democratic government. And one of the first decisions of this government was to create what is called now a Truth Commission. This commission was composed by 15 members of the society who had to investigate around 6 months what happened during the military regime. And they produced this report. It's called Nunca Más, Never Again. This commission established that at least 9,000 people disappeared, but the human rights organizations put the numbers in 30,000. At the same time, the justice began to prosecute the main members of the army and the police. They gave some life sentences to some of them. But after 1987, as is happening in these transitions to democracy, always very fragile, there were amnesties and different laws preventing these investigations. All these people got free until 2003, with a new government who put the human rights top in the agenda. And today we have trials against and more than 300 members of the army from the past in jail. Also in 1984, one of the main facts after the dictatorship was that many of the bodies of the people who disappeared were buried in cemeteries. And exhumation started in the country without any scientific control. The members of the forensic services were part of the regime, so families didn't trust of them. University didn't pay attention to this, didn't want to collaborate. So many bodies were exhumed without any control, creating a new trauma for the families. So this gentleman, Dr. Clyde Snow, a forensic anthropologist from the United States, came to Argentina to collaborate in this issue, and is one of the first scientists in the world who began to dedicate time to human rights cases before the scientific community was not interested in general in to cooperate with the families of the disappeared. So we created this organization 31 years ago, in 1984, in the lack of credibility of the forensic specialists and the lack of experience. Our goal was to exhume the bodies in Argentina and our own country, to give them back to the families, to provide evidence in court in all the prosecutions, to train people, and to promote international standards of work. So the phases of the work are related to the investigation of cases, analysis of the remains, recovery, etc. The way we approach the work is a multidisciplinary, coming from different disciplines, and also the media played a key role in the investigation process, because we have to investigate. It's a mix between a detective and an historian. It's a mix between recent cases, no cases from a long time ago, and involve different aspects of the investigation. Who requests our services? Families of the disappeared, local and international tribunals, truth commissions, UN, RCRC, etc. Depends the context and the situation. From the very, very beginning, we understood the relation with the relative was key in this process to create credibility and trust in the families in this kind of work. So respecting the cultural and religious aspects of the investigation, keeping the families informed during and after the investigations, to make the reports, the scientific reports, transparent for the families and clear for them, because typically families are left out of the process, are the last people to know what happens when a body is identified, when DNA samples are taken. So we try to remove that model of science very high, and the families and the society is very low. So to try to put this together. And also to build in local capacity, what we call South-South cooperation, not the typical North to South cooperation, but we were traveling to other countries with similar problems. We don't give money, but we share experiences with them. So our structure, we have a central office in Buenos Aires, an office in New York, South Africa, and Mexico. And the main goal of this is to try to find the remains and to identify them using different scientific disciplines in each context. From 1986, we began to receive requests from countries like Argentina decided to investigate a recent past of violence. So we have been working until today in all these countries, investigating specific cases of political violence or ethnic violence, but also providing training to the local specialists, prosecutors, judges, and also NGOs composed by the families. Every context is different, but there are some generalities the idea is to share in this presentation. Which is the context? Since the 60s, thousands of people were kidnapped and disappeared, mainly in Latin America, in Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia. Very often, the states were the main responsibles under military control, with some exceptions. Maybe you know the cases of Peru and Colombia with democratic governments. In other parts of the world, the dimension is not only political, it's also ethnic and religious, like in Africa and Middle East or in Asia. Once violence stops, there is a new democratic government. The need to investigate what happened when they disappear is a key element to the transition to democracy. And human rights organizations around the world have been playing a key role in this. If I'm talking here today, it's because thousands of women in Argentina went to the streets during the dictatorship, and also after we have a democratic government, kept pushing and pushing the authorities for investigations, for truth and for justice. Another two models of cases which are not the typical about political violence have to be with what is called feminicide. Maybe you heard about Ciudad Juárez in the north of Mexico. Since 1993, thousands of women have been kidnapped, raped, and executed. We began working there in 2004 at request of human rights organizations and the authorities. This was a phenomenon who was happening for many years, but came out recently in the last 10 years. And then it was found out was not only Mexico, it was also Guatemala, it was Argentina, it was India, also Canada, we are listening now. So it's not just a criminal case, it's something where a specific population have been targeted for different reasons. These cases where the media played a key role promoting information have reached in some cases what is called the Inter-American Human Rights System. As you know, in the American continent, we have the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and the Inter-American Human Rights Court. Those instances are reached when the case is reached a point in the country when the authorities are not giving a clear answer to the families. So the family can appeal to this Inter-American instance. In the case of Mexico, was what happened. So we identified 33 women, and Mexico was found guilty in 3 specific cases. So there is a sentence of the court the Mexican government has to follow. It's related to monetary compensation to the families, but also to implement better investigations, better protocols, and new models of approach these kind of cases. The other new phenomenon you have been listening the last days about Asia, about Myanmar, Thailand, is the migrants. This is a train called La Bestia in Spanish, going in the border of Guatemala, with the migrants travel every day. The context, around 500,000 Central Americans pass through Mexico trying to get to US, are treated like second-class citizens in general. Gangs, abuse of them, organized crime, and also there is complicity of the state agencies in US, in the border, but also in Mexico, which are the risks for the migrants: prison, deportation, economic insecurity, abuse, discriminations, and finally death and disappear. Some of the pictures of some migrants trying to cross the river between US and Mexico or walking in the desert. What happened when these people are killed in the desert? The bodies stayed in forensic labs in Arizona, in Texas, and there is no link between those bodies and the families in Central America and Mexico. So thousands of migrants still are disappeared. And also, maybe you heard about the killings in Tamaulipas, for example, where people have been killed and executed. In all these processes, the civil society played a key role, as I mentioned before, usually composed by relatives of the victims, human rights activists, lawyers, volunteers, usually have a bad relation with the state. The state don't like the NGOs, but have a most direct link with the families and the communities. It's totally different. I approach a family or someone from the community start working on this. That's a key element. And they fill the gap between the investigators and the communities. Very often offer logistics, workers, food, provide transparency and credibility to the process. These two words are key, credibility and transparency. I don't know the case in Canada, but very often in all these contexts, families don't trust in the state officials because they are part of the problem. Some examples of the families, demonstrations in Mexico, in Chiapas, in different parts of Central America. That's why the states mobilize, because people go to the street asking to know what happened with their loved ones. So which have been the mechanisms put in place in the last 30 years to investigate these kind of phenomena? Local mechanisms, judiciary, prosecutors, parliamentary commissions, sometimes with local support, sometimes without international support. Missions produced by UN, European Union, OAS for specific places like Gaza, Ivory Coast. UN commissions of inquiry like Darfur 2003, Timor-Leste 2006. Truth commissions have been around 40 truth commissions in the last 30 years around the world to investigate these phenomena. International tribunals, we have 4 international tribunals, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, and one in Lebanon, the Hariri Tribunal, where the Security Council decide to create a specific tribunal, the UN. And other mechanisms, permanent tribunal, ICC, the criminal court, bicommunal commissions, when there is no criminal investigation, but two communities agree to investigate for humanitarian reasons, until traditional processes of justice, no Western process of justice like Rwanda, the Gacaca, with the communities meet together to decide and to have some form of justice. And of course, investigation of the human rights organizations. At some point, all these mechanisms ask the sciences to provide some clues about crime scenes, patterns of the killings, exhumation of bodies, identification of bodies, to interview survivors, etc., etc. Different forensic specialties participate in this process, but mainly, have to say, forensic pathology, anthropology, and archaeology, because the condition of the bodies. There are different kind of cases. Criminal ordinary cases, what happened every day, an homicide, an accident, a suicide. Mass disasters, large amount of bodies, a tsunami, an earthquake. These kind of cases happen along a period of time. High grade size, mainly skeletons, massive fragmentation, could take many years to investigate. And these cases I mentioned before, specific groups like women or migrants. Okay, there is usually a confusion, is a criminal case or is another kind of case. Some examples, my country, we have a military dictatorship, political organization with a military component, guerrilla, civil society. Guatemala, the same, plus an ethnic component. Colombia, we have everything, guerrilla, army, drugs, paramilitary. Rwanda, mainly an ethnic conflict. Nigeria at the moment with Boko Haram, a quiet ethnic conflict and religious. South Africa, apartheid, ethnic. The case of Spain, the Basque Country for independence. Mexico at the moment with the women, as well Guatemala. And in civil governments in migrants, which is a global problem. It's not only Latin America, it's also South Africa, Southern Asia, etc., etc. These are typical ordinary crime scene with a single homicide or an accident, but we move to these kind of cases like mass disasters, tsunami, airplane crashes, terrorisms, car bombs. The challenges are more complex for the investigator. Executions, or in Bosnia. So in these cases, mainly the state is responsible for the executions, which makes more difficult investigation. So we work on an integrated model of investigation, which try to change the model how usually these things are investigated. Usually, the police deal with this. Recovery and analysis of different kind of sources to come up with an hypothesis related to the grave site or the identification of the victims. In this aspect, it's not only the police, it's the social anthropologist, the historian, and the investigator in general. Collection of information, what is called ante-mortem data. To identify a body, we need to compare information. How was the person when the person was alive with the body? The recovery of the remains, the analysis of the remains, and the reconciliation of all the data. One of the main problems is all these phases are done by different state organizations without dialogue among them. So maybe we have an excellent investigation, but a poor analysis of the crime scene. Or maybe the body has been very well analyzed, but there is no hypothesis. That is one of the main problems around the world. The lack of link among the state agencies and the competence among state agencies for the success in the case. Some examples, the preliminary investigation, context, history, development. So we need to reconstruct what happened from the detention or the death of a group of people until the body is found in a grave. What happened in the middle? So someone could be disappeared from the house, work, street, field, any other possibility. Who is the perpetrator? The police, the army, a guerrilla group. To where the body is taken, to the hospital, to the mortuary, to the cemetery. What kind of cemetery? Who is in charge of the investigation? So we need to reconstruct and to put in a big puzzle all these little pieces of information to have an hypothesis to work out. So we work with written sources and oral sources, historical and physical data. Written sources could be investigations by the judiciary, for an NGO, administrative documents, autopsy reports, information coming in the media every day, academic books. In the case of oral sources, we use the social anthropology approach, which is like a life history. Usually the interviews are taken by the police or by a lawyer with a very limited knowledge how to manage an interview with a family. So the approach is a little bit different. And we interview family members, witnesses, people who participate in the event, and sometimes with perpetrators of the event. Which are the usual problems? In general, investigations start years after the conflict. Police, lawyers, prosecutors in charge. We mentioned before, families very often don't trust in them. Lack of coordination, overlap. Everybody has a database. There is no coordination of databases. Records not available. Perpetrators are present and free, very usually. No relation with NGOs. Poor ante-mortem information. To think the DNA is going to solve everything. You saw today in CSI and Bones, DNA is magic. And lack of credibility in state agents. So, for example, what kind of thing we have to know? We need to understand the conflict. This is an example from Sri Lanka. Every conflict has a chronology, and we need to understand that chronology to situate the events. Which are the groups involved in the conflict? All the participants. This, for example, one of the groups in Sudan during that full conflict. And each conflict has a different modality. In the case of South Africa, for example, there were 3 kinds of disappearances. Only 200 cases of people who disappear in the typical style of disappearances, we know. Other people who went to exile, members of ANC, who come back to the country in military operations and were killed. And then most of the victims is the violence between the 2 main parties at that moment in South Africa, the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. So each model is different, so we need to keep in mind that we cannot apply a model from one country to the other. Other thing we need to understand, how the country is divided from military purposes during the conflict. Who is responsible of what, which is the chain of command. That's why we need to know very well how the state organize themselves to understand the phenomenon. Modus operandi, this again from the conflict in Darfur, how some specific villages are attacked, people taken from the villages and taken to other places to be killed in most of the cases. Testimonies of the victims, all source of information in front of specific commissions. List of victims, to identify people, to find people, we need concrete names and a list of victims. Archives. State bureaucracy produce all the times documents. So those documents very often are not destroyed, and it's the main source of information in most of these investigations, from Iraq, from Paraguay, from Cambodia, pictures of victims. Official records, there's a state bureaucracy producing these documents. As well as in Auschwitz, when a train arrived to the concentration camp, there is a bureaucrat filling forms. The same thing happened in this more contemporary process. There are different kinds of archives. Some countries where these archives have been found. Always there is someone who remembers. Usually there are several copies of the same document, and very often there are records out of the country about these phenomena. This is a book, it's a cemetery book from my country with record when bodies from disappeared people get inside the cemetery, some the condition of some of the archives, so there's no easy task sometimes. Also the grave diggers have information. Administrative records, a police station in South Africa, record from apartheid time. Death certificates. So the bureaucracy of the state produce these documents, and very often we don't know where to look for, how to analyze this information. Police records, fingerprints of the victims. To follow what happened with the body, this is after the fall of Tripoli in 2011 when Gaddafi left Tripoli. So most of the bodies of people killed in Tripoli were to the hospital, were not disappeared. So from the hospital went to several graves. So to track what happened with the disappearance of the person until the last moment is part of the investigation. Again from Cambodia. Autopsy reports. Intelligence reports, the most difficult to get, but sometimes it's possible to find them. US secret documents. All US embassies produce intelligence reports around the world, and in Latin America have been very useful to find information, to have data, because the local embassy produce every day during the conflict report to the State Department, and according to the Freedom Act, after 25 years or 30, it's possible to get access to some information. Not everything is open, but still we found information about different conflicts. Something not traditional. One day, a woman approached our office and said, I'm a physician, how I can help? We don't know, physics is not a traditional discipline. And we said, we have a problem, we have all these people disappear. We know some of them the political affiliation, others we don't know. It's a specific city, and it's a period of time. And she said, let me use the network theory to see clusters of information, how the people are associated, the people who disappear. So it's another way to introduce other disciplines. That's why it's so important to incorporate in these processes the university and the academy. Sometimes, usually the legal system and the police don't know about these kind of things. They do the typical police work. But universities very often have resources that could be useful in these investigations. As I mentioned before, truth, justice, reparation, and memory are the main words in all these processes. Doesn't matter the country, the religious process, the culture, always is the same. Mainly women going to the street asking to know what happened. But usually they are very bad treated. This is coming from a mother in Mexico. After my daughter was found dead, the police and investigators told me that she was killed because she was wearing a short skirt and was pretty. The reply from the authorities. Another one from Colombia, addressing the investigators. I already provide blood samples to 3 different institutions. From the skeleton, we're taking 5 samples, and after 2 years waiting, I don't know the results. My father is dying without knowing what happened with our son. This is the typical situations in this process. The state thinking this doing a favor to the families, and no is the obligation to investigate. This is what we try to inverse and to remove through this kind of work. Talking with the families, working with them, addressing their expectations, their doubts, going to the context. Very often these people don't have any money to go to the cities. We are far away in rural areas. It's one of the ways to make the process transparent. Explaining what is possible and what is not possible in a simple language. Taking, for example, samples with them. Explaining during the exhumations why we have to take the bones and take it to the mortuary in the city, why we need to remove the bones, if the bones are going to get back. And explaining results. This case is from South Africa, so my colleagues are explaining to these mothers how it was possible with a little piece of bone is the person who was alive, full of life, and was killed, executed, and blown in pieces. And now we are telling them this little piece of bone is the loved one. So they say, we want to see it. How is this possible? That's a way to make science credible and transparent for the families and to get credibility. Expectations. This again from Darfur. All women have been raped. They heard the news. The UN was arriving to the village to take information, and only a few could give testimony because there was no possibilities to spend more time because security reasons. So to raise expectations of the families when we take samples is a very sensitive process. We get information from them, we have to bring something back and to put some time. We cannot tell them maybe at some point in the future we will find your loved one. So we need at least to be able to have some kind of communication about that. So to collect this information is not just to make an interview for 1 hour to a family. It takes something longer. Expectations, the context, aspect, cultural and religious aspects, the concept of health and the community, something people don't pay attention. What is something very unhealthy for me, for the other community could be totally unhealthy. For example, interviewing families in some contexts, I ask, how are the teeth of your loved one? They say, all good, no problem. You look around, everybody have missing teeth. In our context, that could be a problem with the teeth. In that context, it was okay. So it was not information for them relevant. So that's why it's not only a police activity. We need to use other approach to this kind of things. So that's why information is important, to connect the missing person with the bodies. We use different databases, have been created already around the world for these kind of processes. It's no need to invent the well all the time. And then the recovery of the remains, different scenarios, different contexts, and every context is different. Bodies in the surface, bodies in cemeteries, bodies in not very well organized cemeteries, in the fields, in wells. As you can see, there are many, many ways in this process to dispose the bodies. It's not only the bodies, also the context. When a whole village is attacked, the kind of information we can get from this kind of evidence we can collect. From my country, from Argentina, a former detention center, after 30 years was found this. It looks like nothing, but was an electric shock button. Very often these exhumations are done without any scientific criteria, producing destruction of the remains. That's why we use this discipline, forensic archaeology. We do a proper recovery and analysis. And usually we have two moments, the assessment of the situation and then the recovery. To assess the situations means to get sometimes authorization for the local people, independently the legal context, to visit the areas. These are the typical areas we used to work in rural areas. To clean the places. Sometimes there is no time for these kind of assessments because the situation is an emergency, like again in Libya in 2011, where all the people working in this were voluntaries. They want to help and assist. How we find the grave sites? Different ways, from testimonies, documents, and different kind of information. Testimonies from witnesses. We have primary witnesses, people who participate or saw directly the event and secondary witnesses, people who heard about but was not present. Evidence in the site. Sometimes everybody at the village knows the location of the graves, also the children. So local knowledge is very important. This in Kashmir, where thousands of people disappeared in the last 15, 20 years. In every village in the north of India, you found these cemeteries protected by the local community. They cannot do anything because Indian authorities don't allow to open these graves and to investigate. Sometimes the places are huge, which is more complex, and we have to be clear with the families about the possibilities. Also, there is geopolitics of this. In Bosnia, we invest in the last 15 years millions and millions of dollars in forensic operations, but was totally different when you go to Angola, to Rwanda, to Congo, or to East Timor. The international community don't want to invest in this kind of context in general. Always the population wants to participate, to take place. So, and sometimes it's possible to reconstruct an event using different disciplines. In this case, it's 10 people were executed in this tree in El Salvador, and 20 years later it's possible to find the bullets still in the area. Individual graves, the position of the bodies. Sometimes we can see the behavior according to this. This is in Guatemala. The bodies are these because the families, after the massacre, got down to the village and buried the bodies with some respect. In other cases like this one in Ethiopia, the perpetrators put the body inside the grave. So we can get personal belongings, cause of death. And then we take the remains to the lab, where they're analyzed to try to identify them and to establish the cause of death. We work with bones, which is different timing and different possibilities. Sometimes the cases are commingled, which make more difficult the analysis. Just for you to have an idea, the cheapest analysis in genetics in DNA, which is nuclear, costs around $400 for a simple piece. And imagine a human skeleton have around 200 bones. This case is an helicopter down in the conflict between Georgia, Abkhazia, and the Caucasus, with 17 people, and we have thousands of little pieces. So it's impossible to analyze every piece. The only case where every piece is being analyzed was 9/11 in US, with no limitation for the budget. But in the rest of the world, of course, there are limitations. So there are complex cases. The lab we have in Cyprus, also where people were commingled inside the grave sites. And then the identification process. To establish the cause of death in these kind of cases is not a problem. The problem is to identify the remains. When lawyers, prosecutors, media say, do DNA analysis. And DNA analysis is not a magic solution. Sometimes it's impossible to get DNA from the bones. Sometimes happen what is called fake positives, when there is a positive result but was a genetic variation. This particularly happened in big cases. So it's a multidisciplinary approach to try to identify the bodies. So in the last years, some specific data banks with genetic information have been created around the world, very few for these kind of cases, in Argentina, in the Balkans, in Chile, and Cyprus, focusing this kind of investigations. And finally, the needs of the family to have some closure. Doesn't matter the country, doesn't matter the language, the religious, always there is a need to find some closure in this. To have a grave where you can take a flower, or they can visit every time they want to visit, some official acknowledgement from the authorities, and to respect all the rituals which are part of the human being about the reburial of the remains. So this has been the contribution of science in the last 30 years in this field. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Yes?
How do you get permission from the states to dig and exhume bodies?
Well, when we work in these cases or any cases, usually it's not the state, it's the local prosecutor or judge who have the investigation on their hands. So they decide to investigate or not. In some cases, the state supports this process, providing funds and all the possibilities, as in Colombia, for example. In other cases, the state denied any support, like in Zimbabwe, which has been almost impossible to investigate. But we work for the judges, for the authorities. Yes?
How many people work for your organization?
We are 60 people, mainly most of us in Buenos Aires. Now we have a big office in Mexico because of the situation in Mexico. Most of them young people have been incorporated into the team, and also sometimes we call colleagues from other countries to help us in the cases.
It's not a lot of people for so much work that you do.
No. There's a lot of people. There are other organizations as our organization. There is one in US called Physicians for Human Rights. There is one in the Balkans called ACMP. There is a specific team in Guatemala. But unfortunately, the academic world is not very supportive to the families in general around the world. People think all we say is it would have been more people, more bodies who have been identified, more people found. But for many reasons, academics feel like they don't want to leave the bubbles of the universities. And it's a shame because in all these countries there are capacity. In some countries it's very dangerous, in others not. But always we say that at least in our country, when we went to a public university, we have a social responsibility as a scientist to do something. So in our case it's this, but there are many ways to do it. Yes?
One thing that we've looked at here is the DNA data bank and the plans for it sort of down the road. One thing that's come up is there are some number of unidentified remains across the country that have been buried, for which DNA has not yet been extracted. So in order to populate the DNA data bank, we would need the DNA from those unidentified remains. Some of the coroner's offices that we spoke with wouldn't sort of say whether or not they would be willing to exhume those bodies. I'm just kind of wondering, in Canada, I can't imagine that NGOs or organizations like yours would be allowed to do the exhumation. I think it's under law, it's the coroners that would have to do it. So what will be like the cost and effort associated with exhuming bodies? I'm just wondering, what is that barrier?
I mean, the cost?
Yeah.
In terms of money?
Time.
I mean, for example, next week we are start a mission in Georgia and Caucasia. We're going to exhume in 4 weeks around 150 bodies, a team of 8 people. And to analyze 600 samples or 2,000 samples, bone samples, for a big DNA lab, which are not many around the world with the capacity, it could take, to do the nuclear, 8 months probably. So it could be a complete profile if there is enough DNA in the bones. It's not a, but it's interesting, that excuse you mentioned is the same excuse used by Indian authorities about not opening the graves in Kashmir because they say it's so expensive and so difficult, which is really...
Yeah, they haven't said that they won't do it, but our understanding is that the responsibility would lie with the coroners to pay for it and to actually do it. So I think it's different. Mass graves to me would be obviously more expensive because you're not sure which one belongs to who, and so you have to test more of them than you would in an individual grave. So it seems to me like if it's nuclear, it'd be like the $400. If it's mitochondrial, I'm assuming it's more.
Mitochondrial is more expensive, but very often you don't need to go to mitochondrial. Mitochondrial you go when, in Vietnam, for example, we use mitochondrial because the soil in Vietnam is very acid and destroys the bone. That is very expensive, but depends the context here. The thing is, what happened is a family in one of the areas you mentioned, the lawyer of the family say, I have a suspect that my daughter could be in this cemetery, no identified, which is the argument for the coroner to say, no, I cannot open the grave. If a lawyer representing the family presents a request, which is a normal process.
Right, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong or not, but there's an issue around jurisdiction because that almost becomes a missing persons, then you have to almost go to police for that.
Well, doesn't matter the police, but I guess you have the right to have a personal lawyer here. and the lawyer can represent you in front of the court or whatever jurisdiction, and which could be the argument for the coroner to say, it's not your loved one, when nobody knows who is, but it's in my region. I mean, it would be good to test that. The problem with these things are left to the individual decision of a coroner. That's one of the main problems of the coroner system. When you have a proper court who really take these things on board and can do it. But it's technically, in terms of money, it's totally possible to do it. I mean, if very poor countries like Guatemala or I don't know, Timor had exhumed hundreds of bodies in the last 10 years, how Canada could do it a number of 600 bodies or whatever the number. I think it's more a political decision than and that is the level where the thing had to be taken. You cannot rely on individual decisions to these processes. And really, it could be financial to some family for sure, but I'm sure those 600 bodies are related, some of them, not all, to these missing people. And at least one is enough. It's enough in terms of to show if there was some relation between these missing people and those bodies. Yes?
Could you, I was very interested about how easy it is to miss how big the problem is because, you know, police think it's just an everyday murder, or how do you come to the conclusion where you're drawing patterns and saying this is targeted at migrant workers or this is targeted at women? When do you reach the point where you collect those themes together and don't make the mistake of dismissing it?
Well, the way to do it is to see the patterns. The case of Ciudad Juarez, all were women, young, working in the factories, many of them not living in Ciudad Juarez but coming from different parts of Mexico. The bodies usually were put in the desert outside the cities. And very poor families in general. That's a pattern, one of the possibilities of the pattern. So we need to study the pattern of the victims, the places where the bodies are disposed, and which families are affected by this. And also sometimes the attitude of the authorities. In the case of Mexico, everybody knew where women killed, so nobody paid attention about that. But it's something sometimes you have to demonstrate, because the key point is to move from a normal criminal case to these specific cases. We need new operations and new protocols. So it's a total mistake to apply the investigation of a serial killer to a massacre in Syria. It's exactly the same this. Scientific point of view, when I analyze a skeleton, doesn't matter from where I come from, I do the same. But the context is totally different. And the authorities have to realize that until they don't change that set mind, it's going to be very difficult to identify, not only to identify, as important to find the perpetrators, because this is two sides. Because no, this could be going to continue happening and happening as it's happening in Mexico. So the information from the bodies and from the patterns lead in sometimes to the perpetrators. Yeah. More comments, questions? Yes?
You were talking a lot about ethnic and religious context for what's been happening. I was just wondering, how much preparation do you do to be sensitive to those issues, especially if you're not from the same ethnicity or culture?
Well, first of all, we try to work with a local organization, local NGO. Second, we used to talk with some of the 3 or 4 big organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, who really have experience in the country. Then we need, when we arrive to the country, we like to talk and to meet with the local scientists who know the context. And then, for example, we work in Muslim countries. We work a lot in Muslim countries. We talk with religious leaders. We don't go to exhume a body without talking with a religious leader. We explain to them what we want to do, what is needed. And they say very often there's some flexibility, because one of the problems is, in some contexts, to the management of the dead bodies. Has to be very fast, has to be buried immediately. So to find a common way between the contradictions between law and sciences and cultural and religious aspects. They are clashing all the time. Also in normal cases today. I have in my country a case with someone from an Aboriginal community was killed, and the families denied autopsy. They didn't want the body to be open because it's a sacrilege. Also in my society today. So the attitudes about the dead bodies is something we have to keep in mind when we are working with other populations, and to respect and to understand that. It's not easy. It's not easy because we use a Western concept of law, which in most of the places I show is adapt and put in the middle of something which is a bit different.